Daniel had always taken immense pride in his home. It wasn't the grandest house on the block, nor the most expensive, but it was his, a quiet retreat in an otherwise chaotic world. He had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, drawn in by its peaceful atmosphere, tree-lined streets, and the unspoken understanding between neighbors that everyone valued their privacy. It was the kind of place where people waved hello but respected each other's space, where the sound of birds chirping was more common than the hum of traffic. For Daniel, it was perfect. But that tranquility was shattered one morning when a deep, guttural rumble of construction equipment jolted him awake. At first, he thought it was just routine maintenance. Maybe the city was repaving the roads or someone was having their driveway redone. But as the noise grew louder, metal clanking, drills whining, and men shouting orders, Daniel realized this was something much bigger. Groggy and disoriented, he pulled on a hoodie, grabbed a cup of coffee, and stepped outside to see what was going on. The moment he saw it, his stomach sank. His neighbor, Mr. Grayson, had turned his backyard into a full-fledged construction site. A group of workers was already hard at work, digging trenches and laying down what appeared to be the foundation of a new structure. Large stacks of lumber, steel beams, and cement bags were neatly arranged near the property line, and the unmistakable framework of a 2-story addition was beginning to take shape. Daniel's first reaction was disbelief. Surely, this couldn't be happening. Not like this, not without any prior notice. He knew the zoning regulations well enough to understand that any major construction required approval from the city, not to mention notification of adjacent property owners. Yet here he was, staring at a project that was already well underway without a single word of warning. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and walked over to the workers. "Hey, excuse me," he called out, waving to one of the men in a hard hat. The worker glanced up but barely acknowledged him before returning to his task. Daniel raised his voice slightly. "Can I talk to the foreman? I need to know what's going on here." One of the men, an older guy with a clipboard, finally turned to him. "Yeah, what do you need?" he asked, his tone indifferent. "I live right next door," Daniel explained. "Nobody told me anything about this. Do you guys have permits for this work?" The foreman smirked, exchanged a glance with one of his workers, and shrugged. "That's between your neighbor and the city, pal. We just do the building." Daniel clenched his jaw. That was the response he had feared, contractors who didn't care about legality, only about getting paid. He turned toward Mr. Grayson's house, his frustration boiling over. Mr. Grayson was an older man in his late 50s, known for his overbearing attitude and general disregard for the rules. He had a reputation for bullying people into getting what he wanted, whether it was forcing the homeowner association to waive certain neighborhood restrictions for him or pressuring the city to ignore his zoning violations. Over the years, he had made it clear that he saw himself as untouchable. Daniel marched up to the front door and knocked firmly. He didn't have to wait long. Within seconds, the door swung open, and there stood Mr. Grayson, dressed in a polo shirt and slacks, sipping from a steaming cup of coffee as if this were just another casual morning. "Daniel," he greeted, a smug smile playing on his lips. "What can I do for you?" Daniel gestured toward the construction site. "What the hell is going on, Grayson? You're building a full extension onto your house, and nobody thought to inform me? That thing is practically on my property." Mr. Grayson chuckled, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," he said. "It's all perfectly fine. Just a little expansion, nothing to worry about." "Nothing to worry about?" Daniel repeated, incredulous. "You're extending your house right up to the edge of my backyard. I don't remember approving that." Grayson waved a dismissive hand. "You don't need to. It's my land, my property. I have every right to do what I please." Daniel crossed his arms. "And the permits? The zoning approval? You got all that squared away?" A flicker of irritation flashed across Grayson's face, but he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "That's none of your concern," he said smoothly. "Let's just say I have friends in the right places." Daniel's stomach churned. He had heard this line before, the implication that Grayson had connections in the city, people who would conveniently overlook minor infractions. But this wasn't a minor infraction. If Grayson's extension was built as planned, it would overshadow Daniel's backyard, invade his privacy, and, most importantly, violate multiple zoning laws. "Look," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm not trying to start a war here, but this isn't right. You're encroaching on my property, and I have every right to challenge this." Grayson let out an exaggerated sigh. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. You're making this far more complicated than it needs to be. Just let it go. I promise, when it's all finished, you won't even notice it. I already notice it, Daniel snapped. And I'm not just letting it go. Grayson's expression hardened. Well, that's unfortunate for you, he said, stepping closer. Because I'm not stopping. The work will continue, and there's nothing you can do about it. Daniel felt his blood boil. He knew a challenge when he heard one. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his house, his mind racing. If Grayson thought he could get away with this, he was in for a rude awakening. By the time Daniel was back inside, he had already pulled up the city's online permit database. He searched for any recent permits issued for Grayson's address. Nothing. Not a single approval for new construction. That was all the confirmation he needed. Grayson had built this illegally. Daniel knew what he had to do. He grabbed his phone, took a series of detailed photos of the construction, and started drafting an official complaint to the city's building department. He didn't care how many so-called friends Grayson had in the city. Rules were rules, and he was about to make sure they were enforced. What Grayson didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't the kind of man to back down. He was about to fight this battle, and he had every intention of winning. Daniel submitted his complaint to the city's building department the same afternoon. He compiled everything meticulously, photos of the construction site, a detailed explanation of the property line violations, references to zoning laws, and even a map showing how the extension encroached on his land. The process seemed straightforward enough. The city had rules for a reason, and all he had to do was bring the violation to their attention. He expected a response within a few days, maybe even an inspection by the end of the week. He was wrong. Days passed, and there was no word, no email, no phone call, nothing. Daniel checked the city complaint portal, but his submission still showed as under review. Growing impatient, he decided to call the building department himself. After navigating through a maze of automated menus and long hold times, he finally got a real person on the line. City Building Department, this is Linda. How can I help you? Hi, my name is Daniel Carter. I filed a complaint about an illegal construction project in my neighborhood 5 days ago. I was wondering if there's been any update. There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of keys clicking on a keyboard. Okay, I see your submission. Uh-huh. It's still pending review. Pending, Daniel repeated, trying to stay calm. Do you know when it will be reviewed? We're experiencing a high volume of cases right now, Linda replied in a monotone voice, as if reading from a script. It may take a few more weeks before we can send someone out. A few weeks. His frustration bubbled over. This construction is happening right now. If you wait that long, it'll already be finished. Doesn't that defeat the purpose of enforcing zoning laws? I understand your concern, she said flatly. But we have a backlog of cases, and we prioritize violations based on urgency. Urgency. Daniel almost laughed. So an illegal extension that's being built as we speak isn't urgent? It's not classified as an immediate hazard. And who decides that? The department does. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Look, is there anything I can do to speed this up? Can I escalate the case? Talk to a supervisor. You're welcome to file an escalation request, but I can't guarantee it'll change the processing time. Fine. I'll do that. He hung up before he could say something he'd regret. Filing an escalation request turned out to be just as frustrating. More forms, more automated responses, more waiting. It was clear that the city wasn't in any hurry to intervene. Meanwhile, the construction next door continued at full speed. The following morning, Daniel woke up to the sound of even louder drilling. He peered through his window and felt his stomach tighten. Workers were installing steel beams, reinforcing the second level of the extension. It wasn't just an addition anymore. It was becoming a towering structure that completely dominated his backyard. Fury burned inside him. The city might not care, but he wasn't about to sit around and let Grayson get away with this. He needed to find another way to get their attention. That afternoon, he drove to City Hall in person. Maybe if he stood in front of someone face to face, they'd take him more seriously. He marched into the building department's office, bypassed the front desk, and approached a city inspector's desk. Excuse me, he said, his voice firm but controlled. I need to speak to someone about a construction violation. I've already filed a complaint, but no one's doing anything about it. The inspector, a middle-aged man with glasses, barely looked up from his computer. Sir, if you've already submitted a complaint, it's in the system. That's how we process these things. I get that, Daniel said, keeping his temper in check. But the construction is happening right now. If you wait too long, the damage will already be done. The inspector sighed, finally looking at him. What exactly is the issue? My neighbor is building an extension that crosses the property line. There's no permit on file. I checked. That's a zoning issue, the inspector said. You'll have to wait for an investigation. How long does that take? Depends on our workload. Daniel clenched his fists. Can you at least flag it as urgent? The inspector gave him a tired look. Sir, do you know how many complaints we get like this? People argue over fences, over trees, over the height of their neighbor's porch railing. We don't just rush out every time someone says their neighbor is doing something wrong. This isn't a fence, Daniel said sharply. This is a massive illegal structure. It's not a small dispute. The inspector leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. Look, the best thing you can do is hire a property surveyor. If they confirm an encroachment, then you might have a stronger case. Daniel gritted his teeth. He had already seen the property lines, but if getting a professional survey was the only way to force the city to act, then so be it. He stormed out of City Hall and immediately looked up a reputable property surveyor. Within an hour, he had scheduled an appointment for the next morning. The cost wasn't cheap, but it was a necessary investment. That night, as he sat on his back porch, he could hear Grayson laughing on his deck, clinking glasses with a guest. Daniel could barely make out their conversation, but one phrase cut through the noise clearly. They can't do a damn thing about it. Daniel's grip tightened around his beer bottle. We'll see about that. The property surveyor arrived early the next morning, a no-nonsense man in his late 50s named Richard Cole. He carried a thick binder of documents, a professional-grade GPS device, and a look of quiet determination. Daniel led him straight to the backyard without exchanging unnecessary pleasantries. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site, where workers were already hammering away. The skeletal frame of the second story loomed over Daniel's yard like an unwanted intruder. Richard took one look at the structure and exhaled sharply. Yeah, this doesn't look right, he muttered. I figured, Daniel replied. But I need proof. Let's get to work. The next 2 hours, Richard meticulously measured every inch of the property line, comparing the city's records with the actual construction. Daniel watched as he made notes, double-checked readings, and occasionally shook his head in disapproval. When he was done, he packed up his equipment and turned to Daniel. Your neighbor's extension is encroaching onto your property by at least 5 feet, Richard said, flipping through his notes. That's a major violation. Daniel felt a rush of vindication. So there's no question? None, Richard confirmed. I'll have the full report ready for you by tomorrow. But from what I'm seeing, this should be an open and shut case. It was exactly what Daniel needed. The city had ignored him before, but now he had undeniable professional evidence. He paid Richard on the spot, thanked him, and wasted no time in filing a formal legal complaint. This time, he attached the survey report, making it impossible for the city to brush him off. Hours later, as he was going through emails, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but he answered it anyway. Mr. Carter? Yes, this is Janet Morgan from the city's zoning department. We received your complaint, along with the property survey. Daniel sat up straighter. And there was a brief pause. Given the evidence provided, we are escalating this case for immediate review. We'll be sending an inspector to the site within 48 hours. Finally, he said, barely keeping the satisfaction out of his voice. However, she continued, be advised that your neighbor will also be notified, and he has the right to contest the complaint. Of course he does, Daniel thought. That's fine. I'll be ready. The next 2 days were tense. Daniel kept a close eye on the construction, half expecting Grayson to take some drastic step to cover his tracks. But if his neighbor knew about the upcoming inspection, he didn't show it. The workers continued as if nothing had changed. Then, on the third morning, the city inspector arrived, a tall, lean man in his mid-40s with a clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. The inspector introduced himself as Michael Poole. Daniel led him to the backyard without delay. So, Poole said, eyeing the extension, this is what we're dealing with? Yep, Daniel replied. And it's illegal. Poole nodded and got to work, measuring the structure against the property line, comparing notes with the survey report, and making his own calculations. He didn't speak much, only occasionally muttering to himself as he jotted down figures. As he was finishing up, a familiar voice interrupted them. What the hell is going on here? Grayson had finally noticed. He strode toward them, a scowl darkening his face. Why is there a city inspector on my property? Poole didn't look up. Mr. Grayson, you were notified about the zoning complaint. I'm here to verify the claims. There's nothing to verify, Grayson snapped. I have approval. Poole finally met his gaze. Do you have a permit? Grayson hesitated for half a second. Yes, I do. I'll need to see it. I don't have it on me, Grayson said, shifting uncomfortably. But it's been approved. Poole made a note. Then I'll check the city's records. Grayson's jaw tightened. That's unnecessary. Listen, this is all a big misunderstanding. I have connections with. I don't care who you know. Poole interrupted, his voice calm but firm. If this structure is illegal, it will be handled accordingly. Grayson's face turned red, but he didn't say anything. He simply turned and stalked back inside his house. Poole finished his assessment, thanked Daniel, and promised a report would be filed within 24 hours. That night, Daniel barely slept. He had done everything by the book, but he knew Grayson wouldn't go down without a fight. The next afternoon, his fears were confirmed. A letter from Grayson's lawyer arrived, stating that his neighbor was contesting the claim, arguing that the property survey was flawed and that the construction was within legal limits. Daniel didn't even hesitate. He called his own lawyer. If he wants to fight this in court, Daniel said, gripping the phone tightly, then we fight. Daniel sat across from his lawyer, Bradley Monroe, in a quiet conference room at the law firm's downtown office. Bradley was in his early 40s, sharp-eyed, and had the calm demeanor of someone who had seen every dirty trick in the book. He flipped through the documents Daniel had provided, the property survey, the city inspector's report, and the letter from Grayson's lawyer, before leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. He's stalling, Bradley said finally. Your neighbor knows he's in the wrong, but he's hoping to drag this out, either to pressure you into backing down or to finish construction before the court forces his hand. Daniel exhaled sharply. I figured. So what's our next move? We push forward, Bradley said. I'm filing for an injunction today to halt any further construction. If the judge grants it, your neighbor won't be able to hammer in another nail until this case is resolved. Then we'll argue for demolition. Daniel nodded. And what are the chances we win? Bradley gave a small smirk. With the evidence you've collected? Very high. But expect Grayson to play dirty. He might bribe officials, forge documents, or try to discredit your survey. Be prepared. Daniel was prepared for anything. That same day, Bradley filed the injunction, and within 48 hours, a judge issued an immediate stop work order. The construction site, once buzzing with activity, fell silent. The workers disappeared, the heavy machinery stood idle, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt like he was making real progress. But Grayson wasn't going to let this go quietly. 2 days after the injunction was granted, Daniel found a bright red violation notice taped to his front door. Confused, he tore it off and read it. Notice of code violation, unkempt yard, and improper storage of materials. Must be corrected within 7 days to avoid penalties. Daniel stared at the notice, dumbfounded. His yard was in perfect condition. He kept his lawn trimmed, his garden tidy, and there were no materials stored anywhere. He immediately called the number listed on the notice and was transferred to a city inspector. This must be a mistake, Daniel said. I've never received a complaint before. My yard is well kept. The inspector, sounding disinterested, replied, We received multiple complaints from neighbors about your property. The violations were confirmed. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Who complained? I can't disclose that information, the inspector said. Daniel didn't need to be a detective to figure it out. Grayson was retaliating. I want an appeal, Daniel said firmly. Of course, the inspector replied. But in the meantime, if you don't address the violations, you'll be fined. Daniel hung up, fuming. This was Grayson's way of playing dirty, using city bureaucracy against him. But Daniel wasn't going to let this derail his case. He took dozens of photos of his yard, sent them to Bradley, and filed an appeal at the same time. The court date for their case was finally set. The hearing was held in a small courtroom filled with old wooden benches and the dull hum of fluorescent lights. Daniel and Bradley sat at their table, facing Grayson and his legal team. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense attitude, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. Bradley stood first. Your Honor, we have irrefutable evidence that Mr. Grayson's construction violates zoning laws and encroaches onto my client's property. We have a certified property survey, an official city inspection report, and the lack of any approved permit. Grayson's lawyer, a slick-looking man named Howard Briggs, rose with a confident smirk. Your Honor, my client has obtained a retroactive permit for the construction. The city has reviewed the matter, and we argue that the structure should be allowed to remain. Bradley didn't even flinch. If I may, Your Honor, he walked to the judge's bench and handed over a document. This is a sworn affidavit from the city zoning department confirming that no such permit exists. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanned the paper, then turned to Grayson's lawyer. Counselor, do you have a legitimate permit to present? Briggs cleared his throat. The permit is currently under processing. That's not the same thing, the judge interrupted. You just told me it was approved. Briggs shifted uncomfortably. There's been a misunderstanding. The judge's eyes narrowed. Mr. Grayson, do you have any legally valid reason why this court should not order the demolition of your extension? Grayson, who had remained silent until now, finally stood. Your Honor, this is a personal vendetta, he said, his voice dripping with indignation. Mr. Carter has been harassing me, filing complaints just to make my life miserable. This extension is a necessary improvement to my home. Bradley didn't even wait for the judge's cue. Mr. Carter followed every legal avenue. He contacted the city, hired a surveyor, and even came to this court in good faith. Meanwhile, Mr. Grayson ignored the law, built without a permit, and now expects this court to reward him for it. The judge turned back to Grayson. Any final statements? Grayson looked furious but had nothing to say. The judge sighed and leaned forward. The law is clear. Mr. Grayson, your extension violates zoning regulations and property lines. This court orders the immediate removal of the structure at your expense. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal consequences. Daniel felt a wave of relief. He had won. Grayson, on the other hand, looked like he had swallowed something bitter. This is ridiculous, he barked. I'll appeal. You're welcome to, the judge said dryly. But until then, the order stands. With that, the gavel came down. As Daniel and Bradley walked out of the courtroom, Bradley clapped him on the back. Congratulations, he said. You just sent your neighbor's illegal project straight to demolition. Daniel nodded, but he knew one thing. Grayson wasn't done fighting. And neither was he. The days following the court's ruling were eerily quiet. The construction site next door, which had once been a hive of activity, now stood abandoned. No workers, no machinery, just the skeletal frame of Grayson's illegal extension looming like an unfinished monument to his arrogance. Daniel knew his neighbor wouldn't give up easily, but the court's order was crystal clear. Demolition had to begin within 30 days. If Grayson refused to comply, the city would handle it themselves, and he'd be slapped with a massive fine. But Grayson had other plans. One evening, as Daniel stepped onto his porch, he noticed a few of Grayson's workers lingering around the site. They weren't working. They were just standing there, watching his house. It was subtle but unsettling. When Daniel made eye contact, they quickly looked away. The next morning, he found a thick envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Grayson's lawyer, accusing him of defamation, harassment, and intentional interference with property. The letter claimed that if Daniel continued his vindictive actions, Grayson would sue him for damages. Daniel almost laughed. This was Grayson's desperate attempt at intimidation. He took a picture of the letter and forwarded it to Bradley, who replied within minutes. Empty threats. Ignore it. And that's exactly what Daniel did. But Grayson wasn't finished. A few days later, a different kind of letter arrived, this one from the Homeowners Association. Dear Mr. Carter, it began. It has come to our attention that your property is not in compliance with Homeowner Association regulations. Specifically, your backyard fence exceeds the maximum allowable height. Your trash bins are visible from the street on non-collection days, and your outdoor lighting does not conform to neighborhood guidelines. Please rectify these issues within 14 days to avoid penalties. Daniel's grip on the letter tightened. His fence had been the same height for years. His trash bins were always tucked away. And his outdoor lights? He barely used them. This wasn't about homeowner association rules. This was Grayson pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to make his life miserable. Fine, Daniel thought. If Grayson wants a war, he'll get one. He went on the offensive. First, he reached out to his neighbors, the ones Grayson had spent years bullying with petty homeowner association fines and legal threats. It turned out Daniel wasn't the only one who had grievances. There were plenty of homeowners fed up with Grayson's underhanded tactics. Together, they filed a formal complaint against him to the Homeowner Association Board, highlighting years of misconduct and favoritism. At the same time, Daniel kept a close eye on the demolition deadline. The 30-day window was rapidly closing, and Grayson still hadn't lifted a finger to tear down the illegal extension. That's when Daniel made his final move. He contacted the city's enforcement division and reminded them that Grayson was in direct violation of a court-ordered demolition. Within days, the city escalated the case, sending Grayson a final warning. If he didn't remove the structure immediately, the city would do it for him and charge him triple the cost. Grayson cracked. 2 days before the deadline, demolition crews arrived. Daniel stood in his backyard, arms crossed, watching as the wrecking team prepared their equipment. He saw Grayson storm outside, yelling at the workers, demanding delays, throwing a tantrum like a child who had just been told no for the first time. But there was nothing he could do. The law was against him. Then, with a sickening crunch, the first hammer struck. Piece by piece, the illegal extension came down. Walls crumbled, beams snapped, and the structure that had once cast a shadow over Daniel's yard was reduced to nothing but rubble. As the demolition continued, other neighbors gathered, watching from their porches. Some of them even smiled. For years, Grayson had bullied the community, weaponized the homeowner association, and acted as if he was above the law. But now he was just another homeowner who had lost. When the final piece of debris was hauled away, the wrecking crew packed up, and the site was left as a barren patch of dirt. No more looming structure. No more invasion of privacy. Daniel finally exhaled, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. It wasn't just about the demolition. It was about standing up to people like Grayson, the ones who thought they could bend the rules, manipulate the system, and trample over others without consequence. Later that evening, as he sipped a well-earned beer on his patio, he spotted Grayson standing on his now empty lot, hands on his hips, staring at the destruction. Their eyes met for the first time. Grayson didn't smirk. He just turned and walked inside. Daniel smiled to himself. Justice was served, and it was damn satisfying.